So, that's the first sort of. It's not a realistic explanation of the world, and yet it makes claims to be an objective knowledge. That seen as static and ahistorical, um, and conflict is considered to be a product of the failures of human beings. It's almost like uh, an interpretation of what humans like, being aggressive and self-serving, is applied to the nation state, right? Um, so a lot of people don't like that, don't accept that. So moving on to further criticisms, realism is about facts, whereas alternative perspectives are about values, right? Observer observed. So these distinctions can be made. Um, so realism is seen as a faulty theory in the sense that it sort of creates a very negative version of the world in which we live, which fails to provide security to the vast majority of people. So this conversation about people and trying to get an understanding of what theory allows us to look at theory and people in particular, right? So one of the other effects of it's dominant still, even now today. Realism dominates analysis. Most people are realists. It's very common to read books that just create a realist perspective. The problem with that is that the claims from these other perspectives say it ignores women, ignores race, ignores social distinctions, race, class, gender, all of those. The poor denies the voice for women. It renders the voices of women inauthentic or silences them or whatever. And so these guys that are critical of realism have got quite a lot to say about how bad it is as a theory where people are concerned, right? So it's selfish, and we talked about ethics, and we don't need to sort of go into that in too much detail. So it's a powerful counter narratives to realism and to positivism have emerged, right? And one of them is the critical school, the Welsh school, counter narrative to realism. It's friendly to people and to individuals, and it's friendly to women, and they challenge the positivist orthodoxy and the traditional approaches. And for things like terrorism, realism is useless, for understanding terrorism, because we need to ask questions about what motivates people to become terrorists, and then we get into a debate about terminology, and then we understand from there that actually referring to terrorists as terrorists and labeling them as terrorists doesn't get us anywhere, because um, people who join Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, or Daesh, or Islamic State or Al-Qaeda, they would have a narrative, right, that justifies what they do. The provisional IRA that the British government have been in conflict with is considered to be a terrorist organisation. The British government doesn't talk to terrorists and blah, blah, blah. They see themselves as freedom fighters. The British invaded the island of Ireland hundreds of years ago, and we put Protestants in the north of Ireland, and we made them a dominant majority in the north. We pushed the Catholics out. And that's still a conflict that we're dealing with today. But the IRA, the provisional IRA, if you said to them, "Are you a terrorist?" They say, "No, I'm a freedom fighter." If somebody invaded your country, if the Germans invaded your country, what would you do? You wouldn't just sit there, and you'd see that your efforts to try and push back against this incursion, this invasion, would be justified on the basis of, yeah. Yeah, there's lots of splinter things happening. Yeah, so it has the potential to still be a thing, unfortunately. Yeah. Um, so, so the debate where realism is used for terrorism, but when you actually start asking the question, you start to consider the language that you use, then the use of the term terrorism starts to become a term that's used for some people for some purpose. So we were looking the other day at Bin Laden's explanations as to, privileged, wealthy Saudi, you know, national ultimately. But he had a narrative which explained uh, why he objected, why he went about organising 9/11, for example. There's a narrative associated with that. He would never say, "Well, I'm a terrorist." He would say, I justify my actions on the basis of pushing back against Western interference in the Middle East. Military bases on sites of holy significant kingdom, Saudi Arabia, Mecca, Medina, yeah, Western and interference, support for Israel, maybe Wahhabi, Salafi objections to, it's a mix of nationalist and religious sort of. He would have something to say, wouldn't he? He wouldn't say, "Oh, I accept the phrase that I'm a terrorist." And it's problematic. It's problematic as well because that phrase "terrorist" is a social construct, and people can move in. You can move into the category of being a terrorist, but you can move out of it. So you can transition in and out, right? So an example of how that happens is Nelson Mandela, on behalf of the ANC, in pushing back against the white apartheid rule in South Africa, engaged in activities against the state, the apartheid state, was in prison, but and was considered by them, by all the similar sort of viewpoints as being a terrorist, working for the African National Congress, its military wing, as it were. But then transitioned out of that category to become the world's most famous peacemaker and famous statesman. So these categories are fluid, and they are because they're constructs, they're social constructs, and that's one of the benefits of the use of phrases like, tools like construction, is that we can appreciate that these are just socially constructed categories, and they are for some purpose, for somebody, in order to get somebody from A to B in some sense. They work to somebody's advantage. So the same logic applies to theories. Realism as a theory benefits some people. And I think you can attach a political orientation to realism. I would say it was right-wing theory, right? Because it's a theory that works in the interest of some people, the powerful, against people who are not powerful. So what I'm saying is these theories, you can locate them politically speaking, ideologically speaking. You can. I would say the Welsh school, as I'll just go on to show you, is a very left-wing, quite opposite end of the spectrum, politically, ideologically, from realism. So when you look at the foundations of the Welsh school, you can see we've talked enough about ontology, epistemology, methodology, and so on. They place emphasis on certain things. The Welsh school, they're all critical of realism and positivism. So I would say these are this is an example of a post-positivist approach. Gender and feminism would be also. Human security, or some broad approaches to human security, would also be very critical of realism. It's like a triangle, maybe: gender, human, critical approaches. They're all opposed to realism. So when you look at where they take their influences from, you see that they place emphasis on security, community, and emancipation, right? So they place emphasis on different things. So they argue that security is not material power, like in realism. They argue that security is emancipation, right? So if you say, well, where did that come from? Where did the emphasis on emancipation come from? If that's the question, then the answer is it comes from a very left-wing school of thought, which is based on the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory and neo-Marxism, essentially. Okay, and you can see that when you see emancipatory communities and the emphasis on individuals on the bottom of that slide, you can see that these guys are effectively trying to produce a theory of change, right? So it's not a harmless thing, this theory. It's a theory of political and ideological and social change applied to the area of security studies, right? So number one, they take their influence from the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, which is very left-wing. And number two, they see themselves as actively being engaged in a political process of political, ideological and social change, right? So if that logic can be applied to the Welsh school, realism is also a theory of, you have an ideological commitment if you subscribe to that theory. So I'm trying to illustrate that politics is involved in all of these approaches. So when we go through, we can see in this diagram, if the question is where did these guys get their influences from, the answer is, you can see Frankfurt School, feminism, peace research, critical IR, and so on. So the argument is that all of this stuff that the Welsh School have come up with, Ken Booth and all of the people involved in the Welsh School project, they take the idea of emancipation from Horkheimer, Adorno, and Habermas and the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory. And this makes them quite a left-wing approach, right? So politics is all over this issue. So I didn't get to say that. Oh, low battery. Why has it got a low battery? I didn't get to say that at the end of the last session, but I think it is worth making the point that these theories are all involved in politics, or politics are involved in these theories. And you can see here it says Horkheimer on the next slide. Critical theory is concerned with the material existence and experience of human beings, right? You'd never hear a realist say that. They're interested in states, right? So realism is good for states, but not for understanding the human condition. So he goes on to say that accordingly, the emancipation of a particular class or group is not an end in itself, but rather a means to an end. The end is to bring society under the control of its elements, namely the human beings that live in it, right? So this is a very obviously political ideological project. And they make claims in the next slide to be better in some ways than realism. So more self-conscious, sophisticated, more realistic than realism, self-reflective, open to change, does not promise to deliver the impossible objectivity and reality, which is, universal truth claims that are associated with realism, but exposes problems from a critical distance with emancipatory intent. What they say is security and emancipation are two sides of the same coin. Security is emancipation. Emancipation is security. Now, the problem with that is a very sort of Western, Anglo-American, Western philosophical concept. Right? It doesn't come out of the East. It doesn't come out of Africa or China. It comes out of an Anglo-American academic discourse. So what I'm saying to you is, this is a very biased European, Anglo-American position. What we're doing in our textbooks is we're presenting to you a very biased English, Anglo-American. The history that we write is the history about how great we are as European industrial powers, plus now America being the most powerful superpower. But that's a history, that's written by us, works in our favour, and so on. So if you were to read history books in China, you'd have a completely different interpretation of. It'd be a different story, wouldn't it? And it'd have its own bias, right? So we need to be aware that where we're coming from, and that this is a Western philosophical tradition. Habermas and all of those guys working on emancipation, they come out of that same European, Anglo-American tradition. So we need to be aware that we're actually presenting quite a biased explanation. These guys make claims to be more realistic because they focus on the insecurity of individual people. They also argue that they're ethically progressive as well, right? And that their commitment to emancipation equates to the progressive freeing of individuals and groups from structural and contingent wrongs. So it's a project. It's not something that's just static that you just look at and it doesn't do anything. It's a political project. It's an ideological thing to get somebody from A through to B to C. It's an instrument of social and ideological and political change at the end of the day. That's what they claim that this theory does. So it claims to offer a better relationship between theory and practice. It's optimistic as opposed to realism, which is fatalistic, because it presents a very fixed, inevitable explanation of the world in which we live. And as the constructivists say, the social world is made up by us, and therefore it's subject to change, right? So these guys are quite different. So that was the first thing I wanted to say about the Welsh School. It really is a political project. It's an ideological project, right? So that's the first thing. Second thing is, if we go back to Anne Ryan's paper, she has been used in the past to, is it going to be in download? So, yeah. She's been used in the past to illustrate, underline, explain very carefully what the difference is between positivism and post-positivism, right? Just very generic. It's not to do with IR, this. It's just a very generic kind of approach. And so if you look at this, it's good because what she does is talks about what is research, right? And then she talks about positivism and research. And she explains in a very clear way the context, the history, the role of modernism in positivism. Talks a little bit about epistemology, which is just Greek for how we know what we know. That's all it means, how we know what we know. It might be Latin, but anyway. So epistemology, we need to explain how we know what we know. And when we're doing our, academic work, our essays and dissertations and all of that, epistemology is a study of how people or systems of people know things. All that means is that when you do your essay or your dissertation, you just need to say where you're coming from. You need to say how you know what you know. And the easiest way to do that in IR is to say, well, I'm using realism as a theory to understand states, and therefore that I need to acknowledge that realism as a theory is associated with a positivist methodology that delivers certain things, right? So that's all you need to say. If you were doing something on individual people, you need to do the same thing in your essay, dissertation. This essay is a critical analysis of the Welsh schools, critical approach to security studies, and it focuses on power in a particular context, right? Therefore, that is associated, that tradition is associated with a post-positivist perspective. So you've explained then where you're coming from, epistemologically speaking, methodologically, post-positivist, and critical security studies theory, the two together, you've explained it. It's all you need to do, more or less, in an essay to show your work is methodologically and theoretically informed. Now that's a big thing for a student, because when your marker is reading your work, they want to see that you know about epistemology, methodology and theory, right? How they're related to each other, because you can't have one without the other, I would suggest. So when Ryan goes through this thing, I'll just move that one forward, and so I just read that out, the epistemological sort of bit to that, and she makes the point further on that we have moved away from positivism, right, the scientific approach, right, and the implication would be is that we've moved with that away from realism, but in the real world we've not done, because Putin has brought realism back, right to the front of the stage again, because when the former Soviet Union fell apart, end of the Cold War, in security in IR there was a proliferation of work on theories and methodologies, but now, and realism became very unfashionable, and that's where all these criticisms come from. But now, the only, for me, plausible explanation for Russia-Ukraine is realism. It's a theory, it's a particular form of realism. It's called structural offensive realism. Mearsheimer is its main proponent, along with some others. And what he says, his theory explains what Russia's done and why to Ukraine. So we've moved away from realism. Now it's come back. The pendulum has swung, as it were, and we're right back. So it's dominant still, but again, realism. So when Anne Ryan says with what prompted the move away, then these general things still apply. The recognition that there's no such thing as neutral knowledge. Objectivity became very unfashionable, and values became part of the narrative, and the ethical bit was different. And so we did indeed move away, and there are some grounds for considering that these approaches are ethically superior. And if they pay attention to actual people who experience insecurity, then they've got to be better than realism on that level as well. So what she then goes, she says, positivism has been challenged, but has not gone. She's not talking about IR, she's talking about generally, in the science world, in the social science world. So her observations chime with what's actually gone on in our area, right? So it's a challenge, but it's not gone away. And what she argues later on is there are some differences between the approaches. We don't have to do a scientific approach with this approach, right? Post-positivism. We don't have to test hypotheses. We can do research that's about learning, right? That's what she says there. So when we go through that, we can see that the ethics It's challenged but not gone. The difference is we can take up a learning rather than a testing role, which is what I just mentioned. It can be about problem setting rather than problem solving, which would be a scientific approach. We're not looking to make claims about overall universal truths, so we're not interested in universal truth claims. It's all quite false to suggest that it's possible to make universal truth claims about reality, because the social world is constructed. Reality is socially constructed in a way which is difficult to understand, but nevertheless. And there's a bit here on the differences, the relevance of qualitative and quantitative approaches to research, which we'll skip, because what we want to do is we want to get to this section which says what is different about these two approaches is that one of them, this one, post-positivist approaches, and with that the Welsh School of Critical Studies, allows us to focus on different issues. And there are four of them. One is discourse, one is power, one is narrative, and the other is reflexivity. Okay. And what she does is she goes through, not in a way that helps us in IR, because she's adopted a generic approach, but in this, the basic message is that rather than being objective and obsessed with the scientific methodology and observation, we're interested in different things. We're interested in discourse, narrative, and power in particular, those three, right? And she has a little explanation there. So all of that works insofar as the discussion that relates to the Welsh School is concerned, because I've said they're interested in emancipation, they're friendly to people, and she says that we're interested in this approach in power, narrative, and reflexivity and discourse. Right. So